Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the UW Taiwan Studies Arts and Culture Program Special Roundtable 228 from Atrocity to Transitional Justice in Taiwan. This event is part of a 228 memorial series featuring two roundtable discussions, one in English, the one you're here today, and there's another one in Mandarin, and alongside two film screening and a pop-up exhibition at the East Asia Library. So if you have the time, definitely check them out. And my name is Ellen Zhang. I'm Director of Arts and Culture at the Taiwan Studies Program. Tonight we're joined by three very special guests who will each offer perspectives on the 228 incident, exploring how public institutions, academia, education, and cultural production contribute to representing and remembering both lived experiences and collective memory. So together we'll consider how these different approaches continue to shape Taiwan's ongoing process of transitional justice. So I'll first introduce and give a brief overview of our format, and I will step aside and let our experts speak. So before we begin, I would like to first thank our co-presenter for this series, the 228 Memorial Foundation in Taiwan and the UW Taipei East Asia Library. So our first speaker is Dr. Xu Wentang. Dr. Xu holds a PhD from Paris Sorbonne University and is a retired Associate Research Fellow at Academia Sinica's Institute of Modern History. His expertise includes the diplomatic history of the Republic of China, the 228 incident in Taiwan, Sino-French relations, and Sino-Vietnamese relations. He has also served as president from 2021 to 2022 and secretary general from 2023 to 2024 of the Taiwan Association of University Professors. So next, we will hear from Dr. James Lin, our very own associate chair of the Taiwan Studies Program. Dr. Lin is a historian of Taiwan and its interactions with the world in the 20th century. His book, In a Global Vanguard, Agrarian Development and the Making of Modern Taiwan, which was just very recently published by the University of California Press, examines rural reform and agricultural science in China and Taiwan from the early 20th century through the post-war era. Then its subsequent reimagining during Taiwanese development missions to Africa, Asia, and Latin America from the 1950s onward. And finally, we are very honored to have Dr. Sylvia Lin Nijun with us. Formerly Associate Professor of Chinese at the University of Notre Dame, Dr. Lin is now a freelance translator. In her previous incarnation, she conducted research on literary journals and culture of the Republican era, language and identity in Taiwan, in commemoration of government atrocity. Her publications include Representing Atrocity in Taiwan, the 228 Incident, White Terror in Fiction and Film, and essays on documentary films. So for the format of our roundtable tonight, each speaker will present for about 15 minutes. After that, I will ask some follow-up questions for us to have a brief discussion, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. So without further ado, let's give our speakers a warm round of applause.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Xu Wentang. I just come from Taiwan, the first time to Seattle. I'm very happy and honored to be invited by the Institute, by the Center of Taiwan Studies. As you know, the tragedy happened in 1943. After 40 years silence, civil society began to commemorate this event in 1987. In 1992, the government published a first report on the February 28th massacre of 1947. And in 1995, the creation of a national foundation of 228. In 2006, a new research report on responsibility for the 228 incident was published. It pointed out that Chiang Kai-shek is the culprit of the massacre and should bear the greatest responsibility. So, in 2006, I just mentioned the KMT, the Kuomintang, and many people in Taiwanese society receive the controlled education under authoritarian rule for decades. So they have been used to avoid any discussion or reflection on history. Some even tolerate the ambiguous situation, no search for truth, no pursuit of justice. They claim the victim have received monetary compensation. So in 2007, the 228 National Memorial Museum was found. It focuses not only on managing compensation and providing comfort for the victim and their family, on strengthening historical and human rights education for the young generation, making the foundation the base for truth finding, collecting historical materials and serving as a platform for worldwide exchange of opinions. In 2017, the Act on Promoting Transitional Justice was promulgated and came into effect. They have 5 subjects: providing public access to political archive records, removing authoritarian symbols, and preserving site or place where injustice were committed, redressing juridical and administrative wrongs, restoring historical truth, and promoting social reconciliation, setting and utilizing ill-gotten party asset, handing other materials pertaining to transitional justice. In 2019, the regulation for political archive was promulgated and come into effect. We have 4.5 million pages of this file were digitalized and open to the public. Now we have, rather than investigating the culpable person or finding historical truth in transitional justice, the monetary compensation paid by the government, which is from the tax revenue, is the cheapest and the easiest task. that has achieved much success. Until May 2022, a new act to restore victims' rights infringed by illegal act of the state during the period of authoritarian rule was stipulated. The human rights violation committed by the intelligence agency have not yet been investigated. Removing authoritarian symbol, statue of Zhang, and redressing judicial injustice. So I will give you another example of Spain. Francisco Franco Bahamonde is an authoritarian of Spain. He's in the power from 1926 to 1975. After his death, he is buried in Valle de los Caídos. That means the Valley of the Fallen Heroes. But in 2007, a historical memory law passed by 127 votes for and 119 votes against. That means the difference is very close. And in 2008, that means in 1 year, they remove all the statues of Franco in any public place. In 2019, his dead body was removed from the Valle de los Caídos to Cementerio de Mingolubio El Pato. That means he has no more worship of any symbol of Franco. That's my simple presentation. I hope you can understand what I say. Thank you.
And next we will have Dr. James Lin, who will talk about academic engagement in the global context.
So Ellen asked me to talk about the 228 incident in academic global context. I'm going to change it into a slightly different direction. I hope this is okay to slightly ambush all of you with a little bit of a different diverging path. But basically, as I was coming up with this presentation, I thought about how I teach the February 28th incident and how I've been influenced by different kinds of academic fields that have come to converge upon historical studies of 228. And so I'd like to bring us through partially how I teach the February 20th incident as a form of my own personal pedagogy, and hopefully through that kind of end at where Ellen wanted me to end at. So the title of my talk is The February 20th Incident as 3 Keys, and for many of you, I'm sure you're familiar with this book, History in 3 Keys, which was published by China historian Paul Cohen in 1997, and this is a book about the Boxer Rebellion, which is one of these major moments in modern Chinese history, tremendous social upheaval. But for Paul Cohen, it's more than just a historical moment. It was a moment that was mythologized and was experienced quite differently by the historical actors who went through the Boxer Rebellion. And so he has this framework of the three keys, the first of which is event. And for Cohen, event is kind of how we as historians tell a history. It represents a particular reading of the past as constructed by academic historians. But this is different from how historical actors themselves experienced the past. And so he categorizes this as experience, the history that people make and directly experience. And you contrast this with event, with the construction of the past, the narrativization of the past, as told to us by people like myself. The third key that he has is myth, which is, in his words, an impressing of the past into a service of the particular reading of the present. And here, history is always told through the lens of the present, when history is mythologized. And the Boxer Rebellion is one of these events that has been very much mythologized in a telling of modern Chinese history. So I'd like to take these three keys that Paul Cohen has given us and apply them to the February 20th incident. And I start here with how I teach the February 20th incident in my undergraduate course, History of Modern Taiwan, which is through lived experience from participants who actually took part in the February 28th incident, through personal memoirs, through primary sources. The one that's the most commonly known to English reading American audiences would be that of George Kerr, who was an American consulate official based in Taipei at the time of the February 20th incident and wrote this very famous book called Formosa Betrayed. I'm going to focus on a different primary source, and that is the personal memoirs of Peng Mingming, who was a very famous Taiwanese political activist, was a professor who escaped Taiwan during the martial law era, and wrote this important memoir in the 1970s. And here I have a quote from his memoir. I'm not going to read the whole quote, it's very long, but basically what this is, it's a recollection of Ming's experience from his father, who was a local Taiwanese elite in Kaohsiung at the time of the February 20th incident. He was a part of these negotiations between the February 28th protesters who made demands of the Kuomintang government after the February 27th kind of events unfolded. And during these negotiations, he was held by the Kuomintang government. He was tortured. Some of his fellow members of that kind of elite negotiating committee, some of them were executed. And Peng Mingming gives us the emotions and the experience that his father experienced, and he tells us to us through his memoir. I'll just read this last paragraph. Totally exhausted, father went home. He had nothing to eat for 2 days, and he was emotionally shattered. His disillusionment was complete. Henceforth, he would have nothing to do with politics and public affairs under the Chinese. His was the bitterness of a betrayed idealist. He went so far as to cry out that he was ashamed of his Chinese blood and wished that his children after him would always marry foreigners until his descendants could no longer claim to be Chinese. So we see this as a very powerful, emotional, traumatic kind of memoir. This is lived experience, as Paul Cohen would tell us. These kinds of lived experiences, as told to us through primary sources, affects the social memory of Taiwan today. And here I borrow from the work of historian Yang Mengxuan, Dominic Young, who gives us this definition from his book, The Great Exodus from China. Social memory, what a group of people, a society or nation, concentrates on recalling or commemorating at a certain point in time in order to satisfy a particular need or serve a particular purpose. Dominic's definition of social memory here points to some of the meanings that Paul Cohen wants us to take away from understanding traumatic events like the Boxer Rebellion. Social memory defines how people today in Taiwan recall the past and understand the past, and understand the meanings of events like the February 20th incident. Later on, Peng Mingming went on to become one of the foremost activists for Taiwanese independence. He ran as a presidential candidate for the early Democratic Progressive Party, and was a lifelong advocate of a Taiwanese identity as separate from a Chinese identity. And this leads me to kind of my second key related to one of Paul Cohen's keys, and that is the influence of politics. And here I'm pointing to the work that's been done by historian Craig Smith, when he published this article in Past Imperfect in 2008, titled Taiwan's 228 Incident and the Politics of Placing Blame. In this article, Craig Smith looks at how the February 20th incident is interpreted differently across political lines in Taiwan. So the quote that he gives us here, "The construction of the symbolic mythology of the 228 incident has made the uprising an important historical event and a divisive tool in the political and ethnic turmoil of contemporary Taiwan. By examining the incident as it is seen, first by historians and then by politicians, I will show how the mythologization process has centered in this arena on the charging of responsibility. As Jeffrey Alexander states, in creating a compelling trauma narrative, it is critical to establish the identity of the perpetrator, the quote-unquote antagonist." So here, this is a process of mythologization, as Craig Smith tells us, and this is the analog to Paul Cohen's myth, that when a historical event becomes mythologized, it takes on a greater meaning beyond its original historical implications, and that meaning is really defined by the present. In the case of Craig Smith, this is defined by the party politics of Taiwan's domestic political sphere, and that is between the two main axes, the pan-green as defined by the Democratic Progressive Party and the pan-blue as defined by the Kuomintang. According to Smith, since the end of martial law in 1987, the DPP has managed to successfully tie itself to the remembrance of the 228 incident, a critical move in its political aspirations. An effective trauma narrative with Chiang Kai-shek as its antagonist has been constructed. During the same time, the KMT have been forced to evolve considerably in order to ensure that the implications of such a narrative no longer have the efficacy they once held in the political arena. Of course, what this tells us is that the February 20th incident is a tremendously effective tool in pointing to the past abuses that the Kuomintang legacy holds for it. And so this is the reason why we see, at the time of the publication of this article, major KMT officials recognizing and apologizing for the February 20th incident. The last lens that I want to bring to the discussion is related again to the present circumstances of the February 20th incident. And so here, I want to focus on pedagogy. And I don't mean the pedagogy of the classroom, of my classroom, but rather social pedagogy. And here I borrow from ethnomusicologist Meredith Schweig's book, Renegade Rhymes, where she describes how the cultural sphere, which Professor Lin will speak about very shortly, but I just want to highlight how hip-hop music for Meredith Schweig is a form of pedagogy. And so what she writes here is that rap songs in Taiwan are synergetic efforts to imagine new forms of post-authoritarian sociality. She argues that rappers' performance practices and pedagogical ambitions, their desires to teach with and through their musical activities, configure post-authoritarianism as a creative political intervention whose ultimate object is the reordering of epistemic hierarchies, power structures, and gender relations. In the book, she focuses on a few rap artists, and one of these I've selected to talk about very briefly, which is Zhang Ruichen, who's a hip-hop artist and who had this song, Gina, or Hey Kid. In Gina, Zhang Ruichen raps about Taiwan's historical past, and very specifically about the February 20th incident. So this is a quote from the lyrics. Chen-Yi's government occupied farms and occupied lands, corrupt monopoly. Only those of low character speak Taiwanese. February 27th, 1947, their police pistol-whipped the head of an obasan selling cigarettes, then opened fire and killed a young bystander. The people couldn't take this, went to protest, went to Dadaochen. Chinese soldiers viciously shot them. The kind of pedagogy that Zhang Ruichen is trying to accomplish here is trying to teach the Taiwanese generations, especially younger generations, ones who would listen to rap music, about an important part of Taiwan's historical past that Zhang Ruichen, I think, wants to suggest to us, is also an important part of Taiwan's present, of its present identity, and of how Taiwanese people understand the influence of authoritarianism on its democratic present. And so here, I want to conclude by pointing to how these three things, how memory, how politics, and how social pedagogy tie together into a different reading of history that Paul Cohen wants us to take away by focusing on these three keys. For Paul Cohen, he warns us, although professional historians spend a good bit of their time doing battle with the mythologized past, or rendering the experienced past intelligible and meaningful in ways that were not available to the experiencers themselves, for most human beings, experience and myth have an emotional power and importance. We may indeed call it a kind of subjective truth that historians ignore at their own peril. So hopefully from this conclusion, we can point to the ways in which the February 28th incident is more than just a historical event as narrated by historians, but really an important way of understanding Taiwan's historical past, Taiwan's social memory, and Taiwan's present. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for the lovely surprise, I guess. And last but not the least, we have Dr. Sylvia Lin Nijun, who hopefully not going to give us another surprise, but we'll talk about cultural representation and literary translation.
Okay, I hate surprises. So before I begin, I would first like to thank the Taiwan Studies program for hosting this event and for inviting me. And also special thanks to Ellen Zhang for organizing and communicating with me throughout the process. And she is so detail oriented. You cannot ask for a better event organizer. So our first two presenters have given us some really good ideas about commemorating the past, like government research, archival materials, museum, cultural productions, and academic reflections. And so I'm going to talk about a different way of commemorating the past, and particularly an event like the 228 incident. And I'm going to read because if I start talking, we will be here until midnight. Literary representation of the 228 incident has undergone several discrete periods as a result of the changing political climate in Taiwan. In my book, I mentioned how writers of different periods adopted a variety of narrative strategies in the immediate aftermath, during the martial law era, and after it was lifted in 1987. I will give a few examples to illustrate the major characteristics of this still growing corpus of writings. Understandably, there were few works of fiction immediately after the incident. O Tansheng's Intoxication Chen Zui is one of the few, dealing with a young Taiwanese woman, A Jin, and Mr. Yang, a man from the China mainland. In contrast with later works that focus more on the suffering of the Taiwanese, the protagonist, Mr. Yang, in this story is a victim to Taiwanese who beat him in their outrage over the incident. He cannot speak Taiwanese and therefore is easily identified as someone from the mainland. A Jin takes care of him and nurses him back to good health, and is later deceived into a romantic relationship. And therefore, the victim of the incident becomes a victimizer himself when he grows tired of her and just leaves her without any explanation. Old story has a sense of immediacy, but it wasn't written from the vantage point of hindsight. And thus, unlike later writers, the author does not analyze the cause of the incident. Even though the two main characters' ethnic identity hint at misunderstanding and misperception. Li Qiao's Notes of Taimu Mountain, Taimu Shanji, about a real-life figure was published in 1984. The protagonist, Yu Shiji, is based on a Taiwanese intellectual, a leftist writer, and poet, Lu Heruo, who died of a snake bite when he fled into the mountains to avoid government persecution. For various reasons, the author glosses over the main character's actions and instead focuses on his flight and later his encounter with a bounty hunter. They both perish in the mountains at the end of the story, but unlike Wu Tansheng's intoxication, Li Qiao offered a somewhat uplifting ending with the dying Yu Shiji spreading seeds of acacia trees as a sign of hope and a better future. These two stories feature a Taiwanese and a mainland character, likely because ethnic differences were generally believed to be one of the major causes of the incident, which is why a short story by Li Yu is noteworthy. The story is called Nocturnal Strings, Ye Qin, relates a woman from China living in Taipei. Her husband was disappeared, and she must fend for herself as a housekeeper. Someone who is not familiar with Taiwan's history and the background of the story may have trouble understanding it. Its significance. Liu Yu and her husband Guo Sunfen were both blacklisted by the KMT government for their participation in the Diaoyutai protests, which may be why she was circumspect and often elliptical in her references to the incident. It is not even clear why the protagonist's husband was disappeared. The ambiguity serves two purposes. One, family members of real-life victims didn't always know about their loved ones' activities. And two, besides the author's need to be cautious, it hints at the impossibility of knowing the truth about the 228 incident. And someone like me growing up had no idea it actually happened until much later. And oftentimes we hear a hint here and there from our elders, and then immediately they will be shushed. Don't talk about this in front of the children, something like that. Later, when democratization is spent in the space of freedom in Taiwan, writers also gain the freedom to refer to the incident more directly with more overt portrayals. In Hu Tangsong's collection of short stories, Gunfire, 枪声, present vivid, horrific portrayals of looting and the killing of innocent Taiwanese business owners and their families. Li Qiao's Spirit in Justice of 1947, 埋怨1947, 埋怨, based on his intensive interviews, present a large group of victims and instances of brutality. Tobias Tamapima and Buno Yuanzhumin recorded a senseless killing of the Yuanzhumin and Taiwanese in his 1992 short story collection, Indelible Memories, 洗不掉的记忆. In these texts and others, we see that while writers gain more freedom to write with explicit references, it may not be a positive term. I would like to now share a short excerpt from a novella that we recently translated and will soon be published by the Columbia University Press, Miss Casey by Lai Xiangyin. Okay. It's in the collection of 白色画像, portraits in white, and Dr. Lin here, Professor Lin here, have written a very informative introduction to the collection. So I encourage you all to get a copy and read the story. But you get a preview here. Miss Casey, a Taiwanese woman, is forced into exile in France and then later in Germany when she comes under suspicion by the Nationalist government's omnipresent secret police. What I'm going to read to you takes place in her apartment in Berlin when she is in her late 60s or early 70s. It is Christmas Eve, and she is hosting several young Taiwanese students studying in Germany. Their conversation at one point turned to Taiwanese Student Association in Berlin. So I'll quickly read this and you can read along. Association gatherings in the old days, did you really all sing Hometown at Dusk? And Spring Dreams, one of the students asked. Yes, we did, Casey replied. Then how come no one sang them at last year's New Year's dinner? Because we got teary-eyed when we sang them, she said. You will laugh if we sang them now, wouldn't you? Maybe. You see, after you've been here a while, that most people's Taiwanese consciousness was raised overseas. Mine is raised, but since there's no more backlist, when I feel my hometown calling out to me, all I need is to buy a plane ticket and go back. They say overseas students these days don't care much about politics because many of the restrictions have been lifted, Casey said. I was petrified when I heard talk about Taiwan independence, but now, to be honest, sometimes it just annoys me. Another student joined in. From fear to annoyance, we probably won't have a clearer testament to the success and the speed of Taiwan's democratization process as witnessed by the protagonist, Ms. Casey. To be sure, generation gaps are at play here, but more importantly, it is also because freedom of speech and other essential civil liberties have become the younger generation's new normal. Does Miss Casey feels a sense of loss and being somewhat out of step talking about the past with her young guests? Later, she shows the young women the clothes she made for herself and tells them to take whatever they like. They try the clothes on, but do not take any, and in the end, her clothes are laid out at a flea market stand. A German woman sourcing vintage clothing for theater and movie sets stop by and offers to buy all of them. The metaphor is not hard to miss here. What Miss Casey represents is no longer in fashion and fitting for the young. Her clothing is now relegated to the stage of historical reproduction. What is discarded in the form of clothing styles from an earlier generation is the old ideology and anything associated with the era of pervasive fear and self-exile. On one hand, it is uplifting that Taiwan is moving on and moving forward into a new era. On the other hand, we also feel apprehensive about a potential historical amnesia. Which brings me back to questions I have been pondering for quite some time. Can subject matters be exhausted as a result of overproduction and repetition? Can a populace lose interest in topics of historical significance like Miss Casey's younger friends? If so, then how long can it take and how are memories kept alive? Interestingly, Lai Xiangyin offers a possible answer with her story. With the continued appearance of his literary works, films, and TV series about the 228 incident and by extension the White Terror era, our memory about the past can be constantly and continuously refreshed so that the past will remain in the present. And today's roundtable is one of the events that can simultaneously take us back and also take us into the future so that we and everyone will never forget what happened. Thank you.
The original plan was for me to ask questions to each of our speakers, but then I think it's very hard to pick out one question for each speaker. So I'm going to leave that difficult task to our audience. Instead, I'm going to ask questions I think will work more collectively as a group discussion. In your presentations, each of you talk about and deal with very difficult histories. Maybe let's pause and wait for the projector. Okay, is it better now? And whether it's through institutional archive or truth finding or academic research or social pedagogy or literature. So I was wondering, how do you understand the role of emotion, like grief or anger, fear, and hope in shaping how people remember and engage with 228 today? Do you see it as an empowerment, mode of empowerment, or do you think it risks re-traumatizing or fragmenting public memory?
I guess I'll start. It's a very complex and complicated question, and it's very hard to answer because when I was doing research, I read about family reaction to their loved ones engaging in these kind of either protesting or later during the White Terror era. And they were not always understanding. That's an important part, that some of them feel hurt for being left out. Some of them felt they were implicated in something that they're not interested in. And so I don't think I have an answer for that, but it's a very tricky path to take. It probably depends on the family. Some family may not take this easily. But then on the other hand, I also read about people's reaction to the memorial flag in the park. I think maybe a day after, anyway, shortly after it was erected, and family came and just took it off the base because they were very angry at the inscription about the incident. The earlier one was pretty much a whitewash, of course, back in the early days. So family members were, they also needed something, justice, a better explanation for what happened. So I don't have an answer, but this is what I can offer.
Is the mic on?
Yeah, I think so.
It is.
Can you hear
It's just kind of quiet.
It doesn't feel yours, but you can shout.
Okay. I will speak loudly regardless, or try to speak loudly. I like Professor Lin. I don't really have a good answer. The only thing I would probably point to is the scholarship on affect, I think, and trauma in historical events is a growing field. So here I'm thinking about one of the books I mentioned earlier was Dominic Young's study, which is about trauma, and it's about affect, and how that shapes social memory. Dominic Young is studying something very different. He's studying the Weishenmen exodus to Taiwan, a group of peoples who, previously were told that on the one hand their own traumas were repressed by the Kuomintang government, which tried to downplay what they'd experienced. And tried to turn that into anger as part of the global Cold War, as part of anti-communism and the communist revolution. And then in the post-democratization period, their trauma once again is underplayed in favor of February 28th incidents and other forms of trauma that were enacted upon the Bunchemen, very often by Weishenmen. But of course, as Dominic Young tells us, that this is later, that not all Weishenmen were involved in that repression. And that they themselves were repressed. You can both be repressed as well as be colonizers in some ways. And Dominic Young himself explains to us in his positionality that he himself as Bunchemen, had a very different positionality. There were people who were like him who said, "Why are you doing this history? These are people who oppressed us historically." And then from the Weishenmen side, they felt that they were repressed unfairly, and so his going into the affective dimension of that history was an exploration for him personally, as well as an academic exploration of that history. So I think all this is to say that the affective dimension is really important, that we can only understand why this was so traumatic. This being a couple different things. One, for Dominic Young, being the exodus of the Weishenmen from China to Taiwan, why that was kind of a double trauma for them.
And we understand that affectively through what they experienced as their emotions through the present day. And the same thing goes for the February 28th incident, that we have to understand this not only as kind of historical atrocity, but also an atrocity that continues into the present because of how historically over time this has been repressed. And in the current moment where we are dealing with that through transitional justice, the affective dimension is important to realizing how deep that trauma goes. Okay, it's a very long-winded answer. I want to speak it more.
228对台湾人来讲，他从被日本人统治，发现他不是真正的日本人，然后中国人来了1年之后，他就马上发现他不是中国人，所以这是一个台湾民族主义的起点。也就是说，从228之后，有很多人开始要追求建立一个自己的国家。那么一直到现在，我们发现，很多人已经很确定他是台湾人，他不是中国人。这个问题可能比较政治化，但是在战争结束之后，很多原本以为祖国来了很好，但是1年之后就马上，这是1年的累积，这个情绪上是每天被加强的，所以228的发生并不是一个意外爆发的事情，而是1年当中有太多不好的事情，所以最初的诉求就是说，我们要自己管理自己，那么也向美国方面或者要求联合国方面要给予台湾人自决的权利，但是这一点一直没有被接受。但是在旧金山合约当中，也没有把台湾的归属决定给谁，所以一直到现在，美国也可以说，台湾的主权并没有确定，还说台湾不是一个国家。这是很复杂的一个长期的历史问题，但是一般的人可能比较不能够接受或者了解。
So 228 incident is not merely an accident, but a mounting and increasing frustration of the Taiwanese people at that time, because before the KMT took over Taiwan, Taiwanese was under the Japanese colonial era, which they realized they were actually not Japanese. But then within 1 year after they returned to the so-called motherland, they also realized that they were not Chinese citizens because they were treated as the second citizens. And then, so that kind of their dream was broken under the KMT corruption and incompetence governance. And then it's because of the 228 incident that shaped Taiwanese people's self-determination and self-governance. And some people, they were more and more affirmed that they want independence. And so during the San Francisco peace treaty with Japan, Taiwan's international status was also left undetermined, where nowadays internationally, Taiwan's sovereignty was still oftentimes claimed to be undecided and undetermined.
Thank you. And I think all three of you kind of already touched on my second questions, but I'm still going to ask just in case there are some other things that we should hear from you. So I think this is more of an extension from James' presentation, specifically thinking about the persistence of the politicization of the 228 memory, right? So if we're thinking about that kind of status, like what strategy, whether institutional or cultural or pedagogical, do you see as like probably any most effective, if we have to choose, most effective for like fostering a shared understanding of historical truths in this society today.
Should also be the best to answer this. Huh?
I can actually just show you the Chinese.
Mm. 历史修正主义。作为一个历史研究者，我也对这个感到无助。就是说，一般的人他只愿意相信他相信的，你告诉他真相，他也没有办法接受。我没有答案。
For this question, I do not have an answer now because as a historian, I sometimes feel helpless because some people, they just chose to believe what they believed in.
And I can give a personal, very quick personal answer. I mean, Taiwan is a democratic society, and so questions about transitional justice, I think, are up to the Taiwanese people as a democratic society to decide.
Right.
That's just my opinion.
I kept wondering if your question earlier is also about whether the families of victims are somehow exploited politically. Were you thinking about that also? Or?
I am.
Yeah, I think this is inevitable in any country with a kind of traumatic historical past, that the victims can be exploited for a particular political gain, and that's something, except for vigilance on the people's side, it's something really hard to avoid. And regarding the 228 incident, I'm often thinking about victims of the Holocaust and how they are slowly dying out. You know, pretty soon we're going to, I think it's already happening, this the last victim out of this concentration camp, the last victim of this. And I think pretty soon we're not going to have first-hand information, a witness, or from the 228 incident, and how are we going to continue that tradition of remembering? Is going to be based on their family, their offsprings, and their third generation, for instance, and people who, like us, or people like you, who are interested in continuing the memory to keep it alive. And so, once again, she asked really tough questions.
So I realized that my last question is probably more will serve better as a concluding questions for this entire roundtable, because I have to ask about your thoughts about transitional justice in town, but we're going to leave that to the end. I'm going to open the floor now in case there's any questions coming from the audience.
I'll try to speak loudly so that people in the back can hear. I was in Taiwan studying in 88 and 89. And the prevailing sense at that time of everyone I spoke to was one of extreme gratitude, if not exhilaration, that there was finally a public discussion about this horrible, horrible thing that had happened and hurt so many people. So it's very interesting to me to hear that it has become actually what in English we call a hot potato, because people, I don't think it's on.
Oh, it's for the video recording.
It's become a hot potato and subject to use in ways that have maybe made it a more sensitive or difficult topic than in the late 80s. But my question is for Professor Xu. You mentioned that in the early 2000s, so in the early 21st century, as there was discussion of how to deal with transitional justice and how to deal with the question of reparations to the victims, the conclusion was that the easiest thing was to give people money. And I thought this was really a fascinating observation because in the United States context, we have had one instance of reparation involving the Japanese Americans who were interned in 1942. But the question of those who are descended from chattel slavery and their potential for compensation, and particularly any monetary compensation, is treated as extraordinarily sensitive. So can you say a little bit more about why, in the Taiwan context, monetary compensation seems easier than other kinds of compensation, and what were the other kinds that were being sought?
Yeah, I just give you the example of the statue of Francisco Franco. In 1 year, the Spanish removed all the statues, but in Taipei, there's still a memorial hall of Chiang Kai-shek. Even everybody know he's the chief responsible for the crime, but he is still worshipped by some people. 每一次要谈到要去除他的这个纪念堂的时候，就会引起社会上的很多对立争论。
So every time when the discussion was brought up about abolishing the authoritarian figures and monuments in society, it always came up with the opposition and the tension in society in Taiwan.
就用和谐的理由，所以就不愿意让这个事情有一个结论。
So the government, they just tend to use a more solution in harmony, peaceful, to deal with this kind of controversy.
所以我们钞票上还有他319个 district 里面，还有他的名字作为道路的名字。
So that's why on our money we still have Chiang Kai-shek's figure, and even in the Chinese street naming, Taiwan street naming map, you can still see his remnants on our map.
甚至有些刚刚说的历史修正主义者，他们认为你们拿了钱应该闭嘴。
Even in Taiwan, some historians, they have this kind of attitude and stance, like the victims, you already got the compensation and reparations, so that you shouldn't be complaining more.
I would like to share my thoughts on this. This has to, in my view, there's a lot to do with the issue of accountability. And with the 228 incident, the issue of accountability was never resolved. And who ordered, and with the research, the one that Dr. Xu just read to you about calling Chiang Kai-shek as the culprit, and then and his grandson actually lodged a lawsuit against the research group, and the judge, the court said just academic research freedom, so he lost the case. But still, the accountability is still there. Apparently, Chiang Kai-shek's family never really felt that they were responsible. The people are, that the garrison command, all these people involved in arresting, executing people were never brought to justice, or not even mentioned. And so And I think for me, in my view, I guess historian may have a different interpretation. I just feel like the 228 incident was brought up too early in Taiwan's history. That was at a very fragile moment of Taiwan democracy. It was just too young, and the DPP was afraid that making accountability a main issue would eventually push Taiwan into a different direction and worse direction that they expected to go. So I think monetary compensation became an easier way out without losing sight. So it's a way to force people to say, yes, it did happen, but let's forget about who was responsible. And so it was easier in that case that when you said it's happened to more easily than say in the United States.
More questions?
Sorry.
Maybe just repeat the question for the recording.
Oh yeah, we can do that.
Yeah.
So I think since we're going to edit, it's easier if we just have that.
Hello, my name is John Cho. I live in Seattle for 49 years. So I come from Taiwan to study at University of Washington. So just to let you know. And I don't know 228 that much when I come to United States, same as everybody. Then I start to read some books, I understand more and more, and I think it's a very tragic situation that people should know. And I'm very glad that finally more 228 incidents talk has been happening in the Taiwan study in this area and also in modern world. It's a free country, so people can talk about it. But again, the same thing is that history is interpreted by the people who has power. And we saw like in China, those people who live in China has a mentality quite different from us. And that's a very good example why they think that way is they have a very successful way of controlling people's thinking by lots of propaganda for them to believe. Now, in the case of Taiwan, it's to a degree similar to that. Although James Lin, professor, would say it's a free country, democratic, so people can say what they want. But Taiwanese people is a quiet people. They dare not to speak things out. So for over 70 years, at least the first 30, 40 years, the people who can talk is those people come from Weisenland, come from
Mainland China.
come from mainland China in 1945 and to 47. So after that, in 30 years, you see the article being talked about is always talked about by them point of view. So some of them has a freedom thinking, so we appreciate that very much. Even nowadays, you can see that this 大罢免 situation is happening pretty hot in Taiwan, but Taiwanese people is always looking for those mainlanders to say some good thing about us, and so we feel very happy. So in Taiwan situation, although majority of people is Taiwanese, but they is not able to express well. Even DPP becoming in power by saying they representing the majority of people of Taiwanese. They want to do transitional justice. They want to reform. They want to do a lot of things. And eventually they won because people realize, yeah, that's a good thing to do. After DPP gaining power, after a couple of years, they start to feel that let's not stir up things too much. Although justice is important, but harmony is more important. So I want to ask all of you, if you can answer, is that what do you think in the future about transitional justice should do what do you think the DPP government, what kind of thing they are not able to accomplish? Need a big effort from people to let DPP know. I know DPP probably will in power for a long time, but they cannot postpone like that. You know, there's no transitional justice really happening. That's my question, and I want to know your thinking. Thank you.
台湾在228事件之后，有马上接着就是白色恐怖，这40年的戒严，让大家忘记了过去，或者是不敢表达自己的意见，所以转型正义是非常困难的。尤其是对于受害者，他有很多人并不知道他的家族之前的历史，或者知道了不敢讲。那其他没有这种经验的人，他更不知道。就像您自己也是到了西雅图之后，念书之后才知道这个事件。转型正义当然是很多知识分子在推动的，一般的老百姓并不是很在乎。虽然曾经在立法院回答官员回答立法委员的质询的时候说，在白色恐怖里头有14万个受害人。但是实际上，来申请赔偿的人就5、6千人，也就是说，很多人并不连取得自己应有的权利，他都不愿意，他害怕，万一哪一天政权改变了，他就又有什么危险。所以我们尽量就是在寻找这些受难者的名单，我们去进行口述历史的访问，尽量把真相提供给大家。但是，一样的，有别的不同的修正主义者，他们会说没有这一回事，不愿意相信。
So after 228 incident, the white terror just subsequently arrived. So the Taiwanese people were experienced 40 years of martial law. After that, and was forced to be silent about the event, the incident happening in the past, and living in fear. And I think, so the transitional justice is hard to achieve, especially for the victims of the 228 incident, because many people, even in your family history, people were reluctant to talk about what happened in the past. So the memory in the past remained blank. And even if the transitional justice, the act was passed in executive yuan, it's estimated of about 14,000 of compensation, but then actually only 5,000 to 6,000 people or the family of the victim came to claim it. So that shows that they were reluctant or they were fearful to come to claim of what they deserved to have. Because many of them, they were still living in fear of the history, that they are worried that maybe, what if in the future the government chose to retaliate against them, just like what happened in the past. So for us, it's an important task to seek truth and to try our best to disclosure what had happened in the past. But then one of the challenges is still some people, they still refuse to believe what actually happened in the past.
I think we can say deniers are always going to deny. We have Holocaust deniers, we have people who deny that we actually went to the moon. So I don't think we ought to let them stop us from doing what is right. And as Dr. Zhou said, we have to keep working on it and keep making it available, to dig up the truth, make it available to the people in this generation and next generation. It's our responsibility to our next generation, and hopefully their generation will continue to pass on the knowledge, the information. And we can't fight people who deny something happens, because you can change their mind.
I agree with everything that's said. I would just add that it's important that Taiwan does this, the process of transitional justice as a democracy, because it's a question of, if we were to assume that we were political scientists, it's a question of legitimacy. You can conduct transitional justice in any kind of government regime. You can do it in an authoritarian regime. But the question is, does an authoritarian regime carrying out transitional justice have any kind of legitimacy behind it? And so I think that when Taiwan as a democracy determines its own path of transitional justice, it carries more legitimacy if you can have the consent of the majority as a political process to agree upon what happened in the past. It's very difficult, of course, in a democracy, because you don't control, deniers, people who will reject the opinions of experts like Professor Xu, like Professor Lin. And so that's a very difficult part of navigating the democratic process. But if you can do it successfully, if you can have a majority that through education can come to a conclusion about transitional justice as an important part of understanding the past, then I think you have a much more resilient kind of truth. And that's what I wanted to point to as, it's an important part of the democratic process.
So you're essentially saying they're allowed to deny because we are a democracy.
Well, I think that the truth that comes out from a process that goes through that is a much more resilient truth.
可以再补充一下。在西班牙，他们通过历史记忆法，虽然两方的意见都赞成或者反对的非常接近，或者要迁移弗朗哥的坟墓的时候，也是民意调查上非常的接近。他们意思是说，内部的冲突非常的大，但是它是一个民主国家，它没有外敌，所以它可以这么做。那台湾因为它有一个外面的强敌，所以它的在野党可能就会跟它的外敌合作，这对台湾的安全、对台湾的民主会形成很大的威胁，所以转型正义没有办法很顺利的进行。
So one challenge of the transitional justice in Taiwan was because Taiwan has a very powerful enemy that's close to us, and so there's a possibility that the other party, which is not governing now, might collaborate with the enemy, and that will cause the internal conflict and unrest. So unlike the act in Spain, where even though the votes were so closely tied, they can still remove the tomb of the previous authoritarian ruler.
Do you have more questions coming from the audience? Please.
I'll just ask. Use the mic. Okay. Most likely question is for Professor James Lin. Because you talked about three keys that I agree a lot to think along with that idea on 228's event, but also regarding the experience. We mostly see how the islander, the Wenshengren's experience being suppressed and then nowadays revoked or being revealed mostly, but do we have any suppressed mainlanders experience that is in lack of to make the whole experience more complete so that this memory, this event, and this pedagogy could be more being transmitted as a whole in that case? I mean, do we have anything in lack by now? Probably it's not the main case that you study, but do you still find there's any case that we're in lack of when you think about history, making case in regarding both the mainlanders and islanders experience here? Or both, all other speakers can respond.
I think maybe Professor Xu might be more knowledgeable about this than I am. I'm not aware. I think one is a demographic issue, which is that most Westerners came to Taiwan in 1949. So those who were present in 1947 are a much smaller number. I'm not aware of any sort. I think Professor Xu is probably more knowledgeable.
Or does it help?
Like a theoretical question.
Does this kind of experience help for current or the Taiwanese people really think 228 as a collective experience for all of us?
Yeah, I think as a historian, I would say the more data, the better. The more primary sources that we have access to, the better kind of history that people like us can reconstruct for the past. So I would say if we have those access to those records, we should do our best to try to publicize them and use them to educate the public about the February 20th incident. I think my sense is that if there were records about this, they would probably reinforce what we already know.
在戒严时期，有很多受害者，但是一样有受益者，所以有人会怀念以前的日子非常美好，但是有的人记忆里头就只有痛苦，所以你很难。人是很复杂的一个动物。 我举一个例子，在花莲有一个家族，他受害，这个父亲还有2个儿子都被杀了，可是他的孙子跟否认228的这个国民党非常的亲近要好，所以这个受害者跟加害者。 变成这个很好的朋友，这个我也不太理解。
So under martial law, there were victims and people who benefited from it. So I'm going to give an example of what happened during the 228 incident, which was in Hualien. There's a doctor and his 2 sons were murdered under the incident. But however, the grandson afterwards became very close friends with the KMT party, and he just kept denying of the tragedy.
Do you have any more questions coming from the audience? Yes, please. Gentleman in the very back.
I'm studying modern Chinese history, and a very important question for mainland China is also transitional justice. So after the Cultural Revolution, how should we deal with the past? And so one example I have in my mind is there's a poor peasant at the very beginning of 1949 who gradually take on power because he's an activist and he pro for the government's policy, and later on he gained power. But in the Cultural Revolution, he was thrown over and he became he was locked down into prison. So after the Cultural Revolution, how to decide he was a victim or not became a really important question. So who has the power to decide who should be the victim of 228, or who was voiceless in the history are still voiceless now? That's my question, and also my problem in my research. So I want to ask for your advice. Yeah.
在共产社会里头，共产党的国家党是非常巨大、有权力的，所以它可以解释历史。它也可以譬如说，他说什么37开啊、82开啊这一类的，好像他承认了错误。但是只有党给的那个历史。但是在民主社会不一样，有很多种不同的记忆，有官方的说法，但是也有民间流传下来的记忆，但是有很多不同的民间的记忆，你必须在这当中找到真相是什么。可能每一个集体记忆里头有真实，也有一些是附加假的。
So in communist society, the governing party holds the absolute power to the truth and the history. However, in democratic society, there are lots of memories and voices going on from either government or the public, and we have to somehow integrate the oral history and to dig which one was true and which might be colored.
Anything to add?
Yeah, it's very hard to say. I mean, one of my advisors at Berkeley, Alex Cook, wrote his book about the Gang Before trials and the notions of transitional justice. I don't really have a good answer for you, Zijian, and this is the reason why it's a good dissertation topic. So I look forward to reading your research. You tell us in 4 years.
So I'm looking at the time. We're running close to 5, but John took away the question I wanted to ask as the perfect concluding question. So I'm going to ask one last question. Shifting away, a little bit away from this theme of transitional justice and ask something more about more out of my personal curiosity, since all 3 of you are either current or former professors. I wanted to ask, what does teaching about 228 in the classroom looks like, since we're holding this in a university setting? Also kind of forcing James to respond to my request to talk about education in the global context.
Oh,
yeah.
Got it.
No,
My
I know.
presentation, that's exactly how it goes in 228 incidents. I mean, it's across different lectures because I split it up into, I first talk about the incident itself, and then I assign Stephen Phillips, who is kind of like the authoritative historian who's looking at the transition under the Kuomintang, under Chen Yi. And then I look at the reverberations of that later on. So, for example, when I teach Meredith Schweig about post-authoritarianism, then February 28th, or its ghost comes up again. When I teach about transitional justice and about Taiwan's democratization, February 28th comes up again. So yeah, kind of what I just spoken about is basically how I teach the February 28th incident. And there's one part I didn't mention, which Professor Xu mentioned, which is I do have a different section about transitional justice done through Joseph Allen's study of Taipei, and it's very specifically, I think, chapter 7, which is about the Chiang Kai-shek statues and how the statues represent transitional justice, and it's not a smooth process. It's kind of a start and stop process, and in some ways it ends up being a very kind of like postmodern process. If any of you have been to Suhu, which is what the chapter is about, and the collection of the various aesthetic representations of Chiang Kai-shek and Sun Yat-sen, it's very postmodern, kind of kitsch. And then that's, in some ways, it's a representation of transitional justice. Sometimes it's absurd, sometimes it's weird. It's not what you would expect. Sometimes it's humorous in some ways. I mean, it shouldn't be humorous, but in some ways, from some directions, when it's assembled in certain ways, it is humorous. So yeah, I go into that as well. And then I also compare that with, for example, transitional justice elsewhere. So like the post-Soviet states, the United States, I compare it with the Confederacy and Confederate statues. Yeah, I mean, if you're interested, you can sit in my class. I'll teach you again in the fall.
I think I like to say I had an easier job because I taught literature and film, and with mostly short stories that we can really dig into the characters and their emotional state and their experience. So I taught only undergraduate courses. So in that case, I think the student could appreciate through this literary works, and they can, at some level, even relate to the character's experience, not in terms of, it's more a symbolic way. So I don't find it hard. I think that's why literature has this power to perhaps transcend geographical and even political boundaries.
DPP 民进党的政府其实做了非常多的事情，进行了转型正义，但是尤其是在教育方面，学校的教育或者是政府的部门里头，也都进行了转型正义的课程。他们要各个部里头这些公务员学习自己的部以前做过什么不好的事情，现在要改正回来，避免以后政府再犯同样的错误。但是只要那个中正纪念堂这个 Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall 跟那个巨大的雕像还在那里，所有的这些受害者还有他们的家属都认为政府没有做事。但是政府要什么时候才会来决定这个 Memorial Hall 的命运呢？我不知道。
So the ruling party, DPP, now, they actually have done a lot in terms of achieving transitional justice, including in the schools or in the government department. They required all the public servants to reflect on the past and to right the wrongs they did in the past. But then, however, for the victims of for the family of the victims, they always tend to take the whether to remove the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall and the great statue as an indicator of whether the DPP is doing, correcting the wrongs enough.
Thank you so much. I know James is kind of reminding me of the time. But yeah, we're slightly past 5, and I want to thank you for being with us this evening, and special thanks to our 3 speakers. So yeah, this is, I guess, our Q&A session kind of reflect how difficult this entire subject is, and I hope there will be more conversation coming out of this. Thank you again.